Hey everyone, it's Andrew. So this is going to be a video doing a book review on the book Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is a famous book. Many of you have definitely heard of the story of Frankenstein, probably in the popularized mainstream media format from TV, movies, things like that. But a lot of you have never read the actual book. And so I just finished this book minutes ago, and I want to do a video on this because I've appreciated it and liked this book so much. So before we start, if you could hit the like and subscribe button, that'd be awesome. But what we'll do in this video is I'm just going to show you this copy of the Frankenstein book. We'll go over a general summary with not giving too much spoilers. I will give you some aspects of the story just to highlight the main key points on why you should read this book. And then we'll just discuss on kind of the overall theme of the book and why you should read it. And I think it might be one of the best books that I've read so far throughout my entire life. So we'll get started. So Frankenstein, this is the Barnes & Noble copy. It's written by Mary Shelley. It's an old book. This is like this vinyl format. It has the Frankenstein label, like a picture of a castle with some lightning bolts on the front. And then on the back, it has one of the more famous quotes, which I don't know if you can see it, but it says, "You are my creator, but I am your master, obey." And that's something that the monster says to Victor Frankenstein at one point in the book. This copy I picked up just randomly a couple months ago, I think for like $10, just because it was cheap. And so that's why I picked it up. On the inside here, it's got some kind of like artwork, kind of this speckled kind of drop design. And then on the edges of the book here, there's this red bordering. The actual text looks like this. So it's pretty easy to read. It's a good format. It's not too small. The overall size of the book is pretty easy to read too. And then nice kind of like string that you can use as a bookmark while you're reading as well, which I actually used pretty much the entire time I was using the book, which was convenient. Either way, so that's the Barnes & Noble copy. It's about $10. You can pick it up probably at any Barnes & Noble. Now we'll get to the story. So when many of you think about Frankenstein, you think about the movies and the concept that Frankenstein is this monster that's vicious, hideous, and essentially is murdering everybody. And you think about the scientist of Frankenstein being this mad scientist that essentially creates this being and says like, it's alive in this dark lab dungeon, that sort of thing. And so when I came to this book, I really kind of anticipated that being the story and didn't really know what I was getting into. And what kind of made me hesitate actually reading this initially was the language when you first start is a series of letters written by this captain of a ship named Walton. And so when I first glanced at the book, I saw these letters. I'm like, oh gosh, I don't want to read this just because it's not my typical story. But then later on, you actually get into like a consistent narrative, and it's surprisingly a relatively easy read to read, at least from that standpoint. And the vocabulary and verbiage that Mary Shelley uses throughout the book is really nice and beautiful, and it's very eloquent in certain parts. So I appreciated that as I was reading it. But the story though, going from like knowing that you know this mainstream like media type thing, the actual story really emphasizes the fact that in the beginning of the book, it's a series of letters by this guy, Captain Walton, who essentially is traveling towards the North Pole, getting a ship going with a bunch of like sailors on it to just essentially explore the world. When he gets there, at one point, his ship is captured in like the ocean where it's completely frozen over, so they can't travel anywhere. And in the distance, he sees this very tall, high-frame guy that is drastically bigger than a typical human, riding on essentially like a dog sled off in the distance. He just sees it haphazardly. He doesn't really like notice it that much, and he kind of is like, did I just see that or did I not see it? Was it real? And then about a day later, he comes across this guy coming that as the ice breaks, they come across this guy on the ice that essentially is like in the elements, completely like freezing, dying, and he asks to come aboard the ship. And you find out that that's Victor Frankenstein. So Walton essentially kind of nurses Victor Frankenstein back to health, and then Victor Frankenstein, who I'll say Frankenstein from here on out, tells him the story behind the classic Frankenstein novel and like the typical story you would anticipate. The interesting thing though is there's kind of like 3 or 4 more main like sections of the story. The first part is really about his upbringing. He was raised in like this noble, well-to-do family. His family adopted like this impoverished girl that they just came across like in this town one time. Her name is, I think, Justine, and she grows up with him. Around the time of like age 9 or 10, he comes across these books written by old, would be, you'd say, natural philosophers or alchemists, who were really at the time like predecessing, looking at getting the elixir of life, changing gold to, or changing like elements to gold and doing that sort of things, which were really outdated and no longer in favor at the time in the mainstream like scientific community. However, Frankenstein was only exposed to that at a young age, so he set in his mind this goal or accomplishment of essentially creating life and doing it from a scientific standpoint, and he thought that was going to be his big contribution and achievement to science and his life in general. So as part of that, he decides to go off to a local university. The first day when he gets there, he speaks to one of the professors that would be natural philosophy or biology, I would say, in this day and age, who asks, "What do you read?" He discusses these authors, and immediately the professor is like astonished and like aghast by the fact that he read those people. He's like, "That's utter trash. Read these people instead, and you're wasting your time with that whole conception." Frankenstein, however, initially is like taken aback by that. He's like, "Oh my gosh, I'm wasting my time," but he still kind of pursues it, and he comes across a separate professor that's a chemistry professor that kind of gets the sense or emphasizes the point that even though these people pursued these other topics that didn't really lead to fruition, they created technology, like different instruments, scientific instruments, came up with different elements that still provided scientific value and contributed overall. So he really actually pushed him into the direction of continuing with his endeavor of creating life or like pursuing that aspect, even though it wasn't in the mainstream side of science at that time. So while he's at the university, he really becomes all-encompassed in the pursuit of creating life out of an inanimate object. He becomes obsessed with it. It becomes his regular obsession. He literally goes to the point of being malnourished, sick, ghastly, ill, thin, losing weight, that sort of thing, in order to accomplish this. And this is very different than the classic sense of like the mad scientist in a laboratory in a dungeon, which is portrayed in movies and TV shows and things like that. Because really, Victor Frankenstein's like maybe 21, 22, 23 at this time. So he's a young guy, what I would envision as being a college student at a university in his apartment where he created a lab and is pursuing this endeavor. As part of the endeavor, though, he builds the Frankenstein monster, who they don't really like. Mary Shelley doesn't really emphasize at this point. Like, she doesn't really give you a vivid image of what this looks like. It's really just said, he says like he's created this monster and it's bigger than human proportion, but that's really it. There's not much description of what he looks like, what he, like how he created him, anything like that. And so he has this kind of lifeless form in place. And then one night at 1 a.m. while he's feverishly working at this, like on his work, like almost to the point of exhaustion, it's stormy outside, and he just so happens like gets it to work. But at that time, there's no comment of like it's alive or anything like that. It's just kind of like he gets it to be successful, and how it's described is the monster opens his eyes and he sees the yellow eye of the monster, and immediately Victor Frankenstein reacts very negatively towards that, because he looks at this creature that he's created, saw how horrid it looks or terrible it looks, and completely is in shock and runs away, in fact. So he runs away, he gets out of the country, like outside, gets out of his apartment, and ultimately kind of thinks about it, and then he comes back and he goes to sleep in his apartment. He has terrible dreams that night, and then later on in the night when he wakes up, he sees the eye again and sees this creature over him, but the creature disappears. And his friend, Henry Cherval or so, who's somebody he grew up with, they talk about him in the beginning of the book, actually at the same time comes to the university, and visits at the same time. So Victor Frankenstein is sitting there kind of saying, I've got this monster that's running loose, or this creature that's running loose that I created that I'm scared of, and my friend's showing up at the same time, and my friend is worried about me because I look sick and ill from how much time I've invested in this. And he goes up to his apartment and the monster is no longer there. And so Henry takes care of him, kind of nurses him back to life. He becomes better overall psychologically and things like that. However, around the same time, of note, like around this whole series at the beginning of the book, he has multiple people in his life die. So his mother, right before he goes to university, dies because his sister had scarlet fever. And then around the time when the monster shows up and disappears, a couple weeks later, his father writes a letter saying that essentially his younger brother, who wasn't introduced before in the book, was essentially murdered. And so immediately in reaction to that, Victor Frankenstein goes home and heads home. However, I guess the town where he lives at is closed off for the night. So he actually walks into the woods and goes to the location where his brother was murdered. And off in the distance, he sees a shadow of a creature there. And he immediately makes the connection that the creature had killed his brother. Despite this, though, there's a friend there. I forget her name. I think it's like her last name's like Moritz or so. That's in the town. That's a young woman, young girl, and she's actually framed with the murder and ultimately put to death. However, she's innocent. So I didn't want to spoil too much, but those are some salient factors into the story at this time point. And after her death and after the murder, essentially, Victor Frankenstein, in reaction to like grieving for his brother William and the girl that was murdered, and the fact that he created this monster that is capable of this, he goes off into the woods to like Mount Blanc, and essentially goes off into the wilderness to just kind of get away and kind of recognize the beauty and kind of get away from his melancholy attitude that he's in at that time point. While there, though, the monster Frankenstein actually comes up to him on like the mountainside. Immediately he's aghast by this monster, like scared of him. He shuns him, says, "You're the devil, you're a demon, you're a monster, like you need to be destroyed." And the monster kind of sits down with him and says, "Before you do that, or before you really cast me out from the world, can you hear my story?" And so from there, the monster Frankenstein essentially starts off from the very beginning of his story, like his creation, and he describes it very eloquently, where he just kind of awakens and he has senses. He has the sense of smell, he has the sense of sight, hearing, all those sorts of things, but he doesn't know how to cope with it. So he sees a bright light, and that's the first sense of sight that he sees, and he can't cope with it. So he ends up spending a couple days kind of like just sitting around a river, drinking water from the river and eating berries, because he doesn't know how to cope with his senses. And then he starts wandering through the woods and comes across essentially a cottage that has this blind man, his daughter, as well as his son there. And they're clearly impoverished, like very depressed attitude. However, near this cottage, there's like, they call it as a hovel, which is essentially like a beat up or old hut that's in shambles, and the monster decides to take up residence there. While he's there and kind of learning about his living and being, he's witnessing the cottagers, or people in the cottage, as they say, go about their daily life, kind of pick up food, pick up wood, that sort of thing, and how they interact. Like the blind man plays instruments, and the monster learns and sees this and becomes enamored by it and wants to essentially win these people over, because he, like before this experience, he does take a moment where he goes into a village, and every single reaction to me is like casting him out, hitting him, trying to destroy him, without even kind of understand, just by the sight of him, without even understanding like the human side behind him. And so this is so different than the mainstream media or TV like descriptions of the monster Frankenstein, and that it's all like this zombie-like creature that doesn't speak or barely speaks, says, "I want to eat your brains," and that sort of thing, and like doesn't have a thought. Versus Mary Shelley's rendition of the monster Frankenstein is extremely intelligent, eloquently spoken, very well thought out, and something that you would never depict as like this monster that's portrayed in mainstream media. So I really appreciated that. And so as he's sitting there near this cottage, he kind of learns language. He learns like humanity, things like that, and ultimately goes out at one point and tries to reach out to the blind man to win him over and get a human connection with the blind man, which he does develop. However, at the same time, his son and daughter are out, and when they finally arrive back, even with these cottage people that he's been watching for months on end, they even react with horror at the mere sight of him and essentially beat him up, like try to beat him up and destroy him. And so the monster kind of in response to that says like, why am I existing? Why do I exist in this world? Why was I created when I want beauty and compassion, but nobody puts that on me? And so that's the point when the monster Frankenstein essentially makes this decision that he wants to destroy the human world and humanity and create chaos because of how they've treated him. And from there, that's when it kind of reconnects with him sitting with Victor Frankenstein, and discussing kind of the situation. I'm not going to elaborate beyond the story after that because there's a lot of turns and things like that, and it doesn't contribute to like this review of the book. But I wanted to emphasize like those main high points about the story and why you as a viewer should read this, because this is a very in-depth story that's very different than mainstream media, TV, movie, that sort of thing. And if you read this, you'll grow a huge appreciation of the monster Frankenstein, the suffering that he went through, and ultimately why he would try to murder, pillage, kill, that sort of thing. It's not simply because he's this monster that was created in pure evil. It's just the world cast him out. So that's really all I have about this. I just want to do this video on this just because I finished this book. I really appreciate it. And to be honest, it's one of my favorite books. I've actually been thinking about doing, based on the imagery with this, doing like pen and ink drawings of it and illustrating it just for my pure enjoyment. So it's something that stood out in my mind a lot, and I definitely recommend it. This copy is $10. I'm sure you can go on Amazon and find other copies for cheaper. So if you have questions or comments or anything, please post them below. But I highly recommend Frankenstein. It's an old book, but it's definitely a classic that is what I see as a must read throughout your lifetime at some point, especially with how like our society has depicted the monster of Frankenstein and hasn't really connected with the entire story as a whole. So thanks for watching, and have a great day.